What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over part 9 of the blueprint only input buffer tutorial series. So in today's episode we're going to be going over the last main episode of this series. We still have a lot to do in the blueprint only input buffer series, as it is modeled after the fighting game tutorial, which is C++ and blueprint. But today's episode is the last main topic that I want to go over, which is the multi-button inputs. So an input or a command that requires multiple buttons to be pressed at or around the same time. Now sure, any command could do this where you have certain inputs that you have to press within a certain number of frames of each other. However, these multi-button commands are commands that we want to press the inputs right around the exact same frame, and we don't want to release one until the second one has been pressed. Pressing two inputs simultaneously, so having them both held down at the same time, will execute a special move. It won't take the first input's move, the second input's move or command. It will take this new command that is only applicable when both of these inputs are held down. They also must be pressed within a reasonable number of frames, usually a very, very small amount of frames, one after the other. So there we go. We can see the importance of having these commands that require multiple inputs to be pressed at or around the same time without releasing them, such as in the fighting game, how I do my throws or X light attacks, these sorts of things. So once we are able to do this, we will then be able to get into the more advanced topics, such as controller support using the blueprint only input buffer, enhanced inputs introduced in UE 5.1, and the input window, which is something that is also covered in the fighting game series, where we have a certain number of frames, and those frames are reused so that instead of having an ongoing timer, we have a buffer for an amount of time that we want to keep track of frames for and retrieve frame data for. Before we get started, I want to give a huge thank you to my Patreon members and YouTube membership subscribers. Thank you guys for all the love and support. Really appreciate it. Before we get started, you might want to get caught up to where we are. Again, this is episode 9 of the blueprint only input buffer series, so if you want to check out everything else we've done to get to this point in the blueprint only input buffer series, I'll link you to the first episode of that right here, part 1. Additionally, if you want to learn about how we set up this world and this environment with our character and our inventory, our equipping, detaching, you can go ahead and check out this playlist right here, which is every episode of the third-person action RPG tutorial series. That is a C++ and Blueprint series, although the Blueprint only input buffer series is a part of this and is a section of it. That's really a demo. The Blueprint only input buffer can be used in any project. I just happen to be doing it in my C++ and Blueprint third-person action RPG tutorial series. For today's episode, we're going to need to update a structure that we have. So going into our structures, we have fcommand info and fcommand inputs. Fcommand info is our actual commands, so how we set up all the controls and inputs required to perform an action. Fcommand inputs are the individual inputs that make up each command. So in the case of a command that is backward, forward, punch, it would have 3 fcommand inputs, one that's backward, one that's forward, one that's punch. In that structure, fcommand input, we are going to need a boolean today called isCurrentlyHeld. IsCurrentlyHeld is going to be used to determine if the player is holding this input. If the player's released the input, it needs to be false. It's not currently held, and thus we can't perform certain actions that require these buttons to be held or pressed at the same time. But if it was just pressed, then it needs to be true. So we know that this one is currently pressed and held down, and it can be used for these multi-input command. To add a variable, you just go to your structure and press add variable. Super simple. Call it isCurrentlyHeld or whatever it is that you'd like, and then make it a boolean. Now we're going to go into our base character BP. You can go to your event graph, and specifically I'm going to be going into a function today called check input buffer for command. So check input buffer for command is where we check all the inputs that the player has pressed and compare them to the command list to see if any of those commands have been triggered. Anywhere you have this fcommand input structure, you'll be able to see this boolean now. So if I scroll over a little bit in here, we have a break fcommand input. You can see isCurrentlyHeld now exists in here. Within check input buffer for command, we now need to check for these inputs. They're a little bit different because they can be pressed in any order. So in my case, I need to make a command that has both of these inputs and they're both set to held. So we know that they can be pressed in any order, and we need to make sure that they are pressed at the same time. If they're released, we want to reset them and disable them. I'm going to go to my class default section of my character and go to my command list. Now, because I only have a limited number of buttons that I'm using here, I have taken my one command that was previously charging a punch, and I have changed it to be charging the jump. It does still work. I just trigger it through a jump instead of a punch now. This is just to avoid some confusion with this new command we're going to make, because I'm using my attack and my special move too, just random inputs. But the important part is I don't want a bunch of inputs overlapping right now, because until we get to the input window episode I mentioned earlier, we don't have a true priority order. And so if we have other moves that can be used before we perform our multi-input command, then we won't be able to see what it is that we're actually doing, and it'll be really hard to debug when we're pressing a bunch of different inputs at the same time. So you can look at my commands if you want. So I have special move 1, special move 2, command 1, command 2. I have directionals, forward, left, jump. Command 3, I have my attack that occurs on release after I've charged it for 800 frames. I just up this value as well. That way it's not triggering every time I release it. Then we have my command 4, which is the one I changed from the special move or the punch to the jump instead, so it triggers on a jump. That's a chargeable command. Now we're making a new variable or a new element in this command list. So I'm going to add an element here. I'm going to call it command 5. And I'm going to add 2 inputs to the inputs array. For me, I'm going to use my attack enum and my special move 2 enum. The specific type isn't important. You could use whatever you want in here. If you watch the other episodes of the Blueprint Only input buffer, you'll know what these are, and you can pick whatever ones you want. For me, this is what I've got. And for the status, I'm using that held status now. We made this a while ago when we made the input status enum, but we mainly have been using pressed and released. Held, however, can really come in handy here because we can set them to be held and then check against them to ignore the order that the inputs have to be pressed. That's important because if I press the special move 2 before the attack, in this case, this scenario, I still want to perform this command. In a lot of other scenarios, the inputs have to be pressed in a specific order, specific sequence. That is not the case here. So by putting the status to held, I know that I can skip the sequence. I just have to check if it's pressed and held down at the same time as the other one, or the other inputs. So I set their status to held. I'm not requiring any charge frames, and of course is currently held is going to default to false. You could set the max frames between inputs if you want here. However, again, this isn't a sequence. And that is our command list. So now we've added a new entry, and we want to make sure we can trigger that entry. If we can trigger that entry, we know we're doing it correctly. And this should also not invalidate the other commands that we have. So we should be able to do all of our commands correctly by the end of this episode. Now, going back to check input buffer for command. Again, this is the big function that we use to do a bunch of different stuff in here. And this so far has accounted for all of our cases. So it accounts for our presses, our releases. This also works for both types of chargeables. So we have our charge and release at any point to execute a command of varying strength. And we also have our charge attacks where you have to be doing something like walking a direction for a certain amount of time. And then when you release it, the command comes out. It's also supported. In here is where we're going to add our support for our multi-input commands. Let's make a new function now, and this function is what's going to be used to determine if we press one of the inputs in our simultaneous input commands here. It's going to be slightly different than our regular logic in this function, so I'm separating it into its own function so that it can return a value of true or false to know if the input we've pressed is found within the command that we're looking for. So for example, if our command that we're looking for is command 5, and we need to either press attack or special move 2, if any of these inputs are found to be pressed, we want to make sure that we track them to determine if they're currently being held down or not. This is how we know that we successfully perform the command, or how we know to reset all the elements in the command and make sure that it is not used when it is not wanted. So let's make a new function and press plus function here, and I called it isInput in multi-input command. Once you make this function, you may go through it automatically, but if you don't, you can double click on it. Once you're in here, you can click on either the name in the function list or the actual purple entrance node here within the function. And we want to go to the details panel and make sure that we add some parameters here. Now we're going to need 2 input parameters and 1 output parameter. This function is going to take in a command, take in the input given by the player, really from the input buffer, but that comes from data that the player entered. And it's going to determine if within this command, one of these inputs is required. If it's not required, we can skip it, and we know that it could be an incorrect press, or it could have been an incorrect input to perform one of these commands. So for example, if my command is going to perform a throw action, and I've not pressed a button found in the throw, we can go ahead and skip it because we know we're not performing the throw. For the input parameters, I'm going to add 2, so you can press the plus here. And I'm going to want a command, which is an F command info. So it's the command that we are checking against. And I'm going to want an E input type, which is the specific type of inputs. Jump, attack, punch, special move, whatever it is that you named yours. But these are your actual input types that your player can press. Now the command is just a type of structure. So we have our F command info. We want to select that one, and I just called it command. The other one is, again, the E input type, so it's an enum, and I've called it pressed input. Now you can actually open up these variables and set some things in them. In this case, we want command to be passed by reference because we could potentially modify things directly on the command. You'll see here at the end of the command, we're actually calling set members and F command input, which is data that we're setting coming from the command structure that we have here. So we actually want to update values on that structure within this function potentially. And because of that, we don't want to be doing this on a copy, but rather a direct reference of the command that was passed in. So we want to pass by reference, true. We want to enable this. For pressed input, however, I leave the default value as none, and I don't pass it by reference. Now, also add an output parameter by pressing the plus here. And this one's a Boolean, and I've called it isInCommand. So basically, did we find the input within the command that we passed in? Now, once we have this set up, we can go on to set up the logic within this function. It's actually fairly simple. It seems pretty long, but it's just broken out a lot. It's not too difficult. The first thing we want to do is take our command and break it. Once we break it, we can get all of the variables related to the command. The only one we'll actually need here is the inputs array. Remember, inputs array is what makes up the command. So if it's up, down, left, right, those are the 4 inputs that are required. What I like to do is drag off of this, and we're going to get the length because we have to loop through every individual input. Remember that length is the actual number of elements. So in that example above, there are 4 elements, up, down, left, and right. But as far as indices go, they start at 0. So that would be 0, 1, 2, and 3. So we need to do length minus subtract 1. And then we're going to loop through them. So that's how I have these nodes here. Another note, if you click on your break node, you can hide unconnected pins so any pins we're not using are not taking up a bunch of space. We need to do a standard for loop, not a for each loop. And for the first index, we can leave that at 0. But for the last index, we need the result of the subtraction. This is going to loop through every input in the command. Simple enough. Now, in the loop body of this for loop, so for each command, we need to grab what input that's actually tied to. It's not like a for each loop where it will return the element to you. Since we're using the direct reference and not a copy, we need to grab it. So we can drag off the inputs array again, type get, and this time we're going to do get a reference. This is why we need a reference, because we need to use a reference and set data directly on that command. Not make a copy and try and pass it back, but set it directly on the command. You'll know you've done it right because the get will have a diamond node, not a circle. That's what I have here. And for the index, you're going to pass in the index of the for loop. So this is getting the element at that index in the array, or basically what input we're at in the array. Now the input, as I was showing you earlier, has type, status, required charge frames, and is currently held. So we can drag off of this and type break to get this node here, where you'll have these four things. You can either uncheck required charge frames and is currently held because we won't need them, or you can hide the unconnected pins after we do the next step. But you're going to drag off your type, and we're going to compare it to the type that was passed into the function. So type equals, and we're going to say equal enum. And for the bottom equal, we're going to pass in the pressed input. So we're going to compare the type required by the command and the type that was found within the input buffer. If they are equal, this means that we did press one of the inputs required by the command, but we do have to make sure that the status is held as well. This is because we can't automatically assume just because we find an element in the command that we will be able to perform it by pressing all the buttons at the same time. So perhaps I have something like left and then 2 held inputs for a backward throw, but I might have a forward throw, which is right, and 2 held inputs. Because of this, we have to make sure if this truly is a multi-input command, or a simultaneous input command, however you want to call it, we have to make sure that the input we're checking against is of type held. Remember, this is where we don't care about the sequence anymore, if it's of held. So then we drag off status through equal, we want equal enum, and you can change the type from pressed to held. If both of these conditions are true, so we press the right input and it's a hold input type, then we can do other logic. So we have to drag off this and type and boolean and pass in both of our boolean results that we found into this and node. Then drag off and do a branch, and only if it's true do we want to do anything else. If it's false, we want to just ignore it, and it will end the iteration of the loop and go to the next iteration. So if it's false, don't do anything. If it's true, we want to check and see if the input is already held. This is important because we don't want to be able to double our inputs. So if we're already holding an input, we don't want to say, oh, it was a correct action to press it again. If multiple keys on your keyboard are bound to the same action, such as jump, and this command requires jump and attack, we don't want pressing both the jump keys to actually trigger the command that we're looking for here. So we want to make sure that the input is not already held one way or another. We can use the get node here and break it. And then again, I have everything hidden but is currently held. And we want to make sure that we're not currently held before doing this next step. So you can drag off the boolean here, type not boolean. You'll get this node, and then drag that into your branch. Now, only if that's true do we continue. Again, otherwise it will just end the loop. If that is true, we want to set the member of the command to say that we are currently held, because this input is currently being held down by the player. So again, using that same get node that we have here, I've got some reroute nodes, but it is the same node. We can drag off of it and type set members in fcommand input. Then you will have to toggle the pins that you want to set. Now, note that if you toggle one, and leave it as a default value, it is going to actually override the value that already exists. So we only want to give it values that we want to change. In this case, we only want to change is currently held, and we want to set it to true. So enable it as a pin, and then set it to true on the node. At that point, we can now call a return node and say that we have found the input pressed by the player is an input required by this command. Now, you may already have a return node in here, but you can always add a new one by typing add return node. And then just check it. True. We want to return true. We found it. Alternatively, if this loop completes and we never return true, that means the inputs pressed by the player were never found to be required by this command, or that they weren't the ones that were required to be held simultaneously to perform this command. In which case, we don't want to return true. We don't want to say the player has pressed the proper inputs for that, because they haven't. So upon completed of the for loop, we want to return node and have it false, unchecked. Now, with that done, we can successfully check for these simultaneous inputs within these multi-input commands. If you go back in the check input buffer for command and scroll over here, at this point, we need to determine if it is the right time to use our new function. When we're checking to see if we've met the requirements to increase the correct sequence counter, that is when we can perform the command. So, in this check here, where we're checking for if the name of the input pressed by the player is equal to the type of input in the command, we can add things here to determine if the input is one of those simultaneous inputs. And if it is, this has another possibility to succeed, because remember, the simultaneous inputs don't care about the sequence. They can be pressed in any order and still be valid. So I've got some logic up above here, and it's going to look a little confusing at first because I don't have it hooked up, but we're going to go over it. Now we got to make this look nice, which is by far the hardest part of doing this in Blueprint only, in my opinion. We're going to call our new function, isInput and multi-input command. So call this function, and we need to pass in the command and the input that we're looking at. So the command can be gotten from this right here. The command list, remember, we're looping through them and getting the index of each specific command. This is a reference. So this is the reference of the command that we are looping through currently. That's the command that we want to use. Now, I have reroute nodes that go down here, and they go into a bunch of other stuff. So it goes into the set members in fcommand info, and it's going into other things that I've made for today's episode that we'll get into in a few minutes. This is the node that we want to use. So you can use it from wherever you want. For right now, it's going to be ugly. I'm going to make it look nicer in a second. But take that command and pass it into the command section of your new function. For the pressed input, we need to look at the specific input that we're looking at within the input buffer. This finput_info is the singular input we're looking at, and it has the type, or it's called the name here, the timestamp, the status, and the charge frames. In this case, we want to take the name from this break and pass that into the pressed input. Okay, so this is what we need to do here. Between these branches, we now need to call this function so that we can get a result from it. So we need to move some things around. And what I'm going to do is actually just highlight everything here and move it over. I made this look a little bit better by adding a few more reroute nodes and spacing them apart. So you'll see that the name goes into the equals node against the type of the command. The status goes into the equals node against the command status. And the required charge frames goes into the greater than or equal to of the required charge frames. Now, this is how it was before. It's just now I've added some more reroute nodes and made it look a little bit nicer on that part. we need to add a new node in here as well, and that is the function that we just set up. So I'm going to bring from the branch before the input buffer the true and call this function, and then drag it back into the next branch here. So organize this however you can get to work where it still looks nice. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect what this return node goes into so I can explain it here live. Now we want to use this return node. This is in command. So we need to make sure that if this is in a command, since this is a simultaneous input in a multi-input command, they have to be pressed at the same time. So if an input is released, then this is not going to work. So we need to make sure the status is not released. We do have a status not equaling release later in the logic, but that's only if the condition is false. We don't want to do it here. We want to keep them separate because this is important after the previous branch has failed and returned false. But we need to check to see if it's not equal to release now to potentially allow this branch to still be true. So it's an important distinction to make. This is an AND, okay? So they can't be used in the same spot here. We're going to need to check in both. So we're going to add an AND boolean here. And we need to use our status. Okay, I know there's a lot of nodes here. We need to use our status to make sure that it is not equal to released at this point. Not equal enum, released, plug it into the AND. We need some more space, so let's get some. Just going to select everything over here. Make sure I didn't miss anything. And move it all over yet again. Now, with this, we don't just want to plug this in to this AND. We don't want to try and overwrite this one. This is an OR condition between these multi-input commands and the equal statement we already had here. So we can now do an OR on these equal signs. So drag off of the AND boolean, type OR, and we want to pass it this value, okay? The equal sign that we had up here already. To do this, you may want to bring these over. Make it a little bit closer so that you can bring the OR boolean over, just like this. Now, instead of plugging in this equal sign for the type and the name into the AND, we're going to use the OR into the AND now. So it's going to override that. We now have a successful OR condition for either of these scenarios. Gone ahead and combined the status reroute nodes here. So instead of having two branching paths that go into the same sort of things, we just have status, comes down here, goes into the not equals to released, goes into the equal sign at the end, and goes into this not equal to released. That cleans it up a little bit here. And what we want to do is make sure that the status is equal to pressed when it comes from the input buffer, and in the command it should be requiring a status of held. That way we know it is a simultaneous input. So for that, we can drag off of our status right here, and we'll do it in a similar spot as the last one. So we type equal enum, and we want equal pressed. We're going to need more space, so I can move this over again. Perfect. Now we are going to need an AND boolean, and we're going to need to check against the status of the command, and it's going to be held. That is the one we want it to be. So we can follow this reroute node. It is this green line here. Make another reroute node here, and equal enum for held. So now I've got more space. Again, just moved everything down. Everything is still connected as usual here. And so we have the status from the input buffer input checking against pressed, and the status from the F command input checking against held. We want to drag the result from the held into the AND boolean as well, and now we have our AND statement. This is going to also go into an OR against this equals, so we need to make sure we compare both of these instances. So to do that, I'm going to do what I did with the other one and bring it back a little bit, and we can bring this one up a little bit. Something like this. And the and the equals need to have another OR statement. We're going to plug the equals into the bottom of the OR, and the OR is now going to return to the middle and, not the equal sign. That has everything we need to determine if this is a multi-input command or not. So we can start putting things back. I'm going to move this back. I'm going to move all this back at once after that. Something like that should do the trick. Clean it up if you feel the need, as there is a lot going on here. I'm also going to clean up this command here. Add a reroute node here above the execution line and above the branch. And we'll bring it all the way from the get right there. So now we check all of our different possibilities, and we have everything working together. As complicated as it is working. But there is another case, and this one's much simpler. We just need to reset this when these inputs are released or when an improper input is selected. In either case, we don't want to perform the simultaneous input commands for the multi-input command itself. As the last section here to the set members and F command info, where we were resetting this data, we want to drag off of each of these and bring them into the bottom element here. I'm going to move this over a little bit so that I have some breathing room when I'm working in the graph. So once you have your execution line plugged in here, we're going to take the command that we had plugged in to the set members in F command info, and we're going to pass that along again because we're going to need it in two different sections here. We're going to need it where we check to see if the input is in the multi-input command, and then we're going to also drag off the command itself to set members in it. So we're going to need that command reference yet again. And we're also going to need the input that we pressed yet again. So to do that, we need to connect the name. You can now drag off of your reroute node from your name or your type from your F input info. I'm just going to do this because I think it's the most visually appealing. I'm going to drag it over and I'm going to drag it into the pressed input section here. So, all right, this is coming from name all the way down here. And then into the is input and multi-input command. So that's where our pressed input is coming from. After you've plugged this into is input and multi-input command, we are going to need it for something later in this function. So make sure that you have a reroute node or another way to access it. If you want to drag it from somewhere else, that's perfectly fine. But either way, after either condition here, false from this branch or after the set members and F command info, we're going to go here. If it succeeds, we want to reset the correct sequence counter because at this point we're in a multi-input command, but we have released the input or we have pressed the inputs too far apart from each other. They're not being simultaneously held. One was pressed, the input buffer cleared, and then another was pressed. And that is too far. That is outside the range of the simultaneous button presses. So at this point, we can reset our correct sequence counter. On top of resetting the correct sequence counter, we also need to reset the variables that we had set initially when pressing the other buttons. So we need to reset our is currently held boolean. We can take that command reference that we plugged into the is input and multi-input command, and then we can do the same sort of logic we did within that function actually. We can drag off of our command and we can break it, and we can grab the inputs array, hide everything but the inputs array. We can grab the length of the inputs array, subtract from 1 to get the last index, do a standard for loop through it, and then get the element, the input at that index that we're currently at. Make sure that your get is a reference, not a copy. Then we can drag off the get to do a break. We want to grab the F command input, and we're going to hide everything but type. And we're going to compare it to our type here. And if they are equal, we know that we have released this input, which means we can set it to not be currently held. Just resetting that value. It's no longer held. It has been released. Now, another thing we might want to do to test this is visit our remove old inputs from buffer function. Now, we set this up to remove inputs from the buffer after a certain amount of seconds had passed. Then we swapped it to a set number of frames have passed. However, we're still going positive. We're going 0, starting from frame 0 and going up, which does introduce a bit of an issue. Now, this issue was fixed in the fighting game template's input window. And so we're going to solve that when we get to input windows in this blueprint only input buffer series as well. So get frame count. I was giving it a leniency period of 30 frames, meaning that the inputs could be pressed 30 frames apart before the input buffer would clear. But the problem with that is if your input buffer clears at a time that is not convenient, say while you're in the middle of pressing one button before you press the other, it's going to reset the elements in your input buffer, and thus it's going to change your booleans for saying is currently held, and thus you'll have one input that's currently held that gets reset automatically and another one that maybe doesn't get reset at all. So arbitrary cleanup of the input buffer is not ideal. We're going to need these input window, this circular array method to solve this issue. But what I would recommend doing for now to be able to test and make sure that your logic is working is to set the frame count to a measly 1. It may make some of your commands harder to perform, but you will be able to test that you're using the multi-input commands successfully. And if you are, when we get into the input window system, of course, it won't be only a 1 frame section. We'll have more freedom than that, so we will be able to perform all commands without any issues with when the buffer is cleared, because it's never really cleared. It's just overwritten to other values. But the most recent values will always be valid no matter where they're at in the buffer. Last thing we want to do now is test our logic. So if we go into our game, we can come in here and we can open up the world outliner and open up the output log. We can watch our command 5. This is command 5 here, and the is currently held booleans. I can clear my log. Now I can spam this button pretty much as I want, and I won't ever use the command unless I press both buttons at the same time. Now I can press one, wait a few frames, press the other while holding the first one down, and it still won't work. And you can see the booleans are corresponding properly on the right. If I am to press one, release, press another, press one, release, press another, you can see it in the window down there, what it looks like. You'll see that also does not work, as close as it is, unless they overlap. If I actually release the first one first, I never perform the command. But if there's ever any overlap, you can see that the command is performed. But if you press them both at the same time, you should be able to get it to perform very, very consistently. And that's what we're trying to achieve here. If you can get this result where you can press these buttons and get them to perform almost every single time, then you'll be good to go. Because you should see that mashing the button, unless you're mashing it really fast, won't trigger the command. You'll notice sometimes if you hit the buttons too fast, the one button may say that it's still held down even when it's not. So I'm not holding that attack button down anymore. But because of the way the input buffer was cleared, that index was never able to be reached, and thus it wasn't ever able to be reset. This is why we need the input window. So even though our multi-input commands are functioning properly, the entire system is not exactly functioning as it should. So certain things may go awry due to this. Anyway, guys, that's all I got for today's episode, so thank you so much for watching. I hope this helped you make your multi-input commands and your simultaneous button inputs work for your game. If it did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do. I want to give another shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys once again for everything you do. I really appreciate it. If you did have any issues with this tutorial, feel free to join the Discord community. There's a link in the description. I'd be happy to help you out. Like I said, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.